Hello, and welcome back to Pints with Jack. Welcome to the Skype Sessions. I've got myself a cup of tea, and today I'm going to be talking to a guest who has appeared on a previous Skype session. We connected through the Conversation of Our Generation, a podcast. I had heard that he was a big C.S. Lewis fan and that I should have him on the show. So I did, and as I was researching him, I found several articles he wrote about C.S. Lewis. And he wrote one about the abolition of man, and that's what I want to talk to him about today. So, welcoming back to the show, Grayson Quay.
Hey, it's good to be back. I am drinking a nice, I think this is a Belgian white ale, and I've got my C.S. Lewis shelf right here, and it's kind of the spillover C.S. Lewis shelf here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's how people know you're serious.
Yeah, there we go.
I'm actually in the process of moving to Wisconsin, which is why my apartment
Oh, look at that. Wow.
is very empty, and all of my books have gone, and I had several boxes of C.S. Lewis stuff. I regret nothing.
Oh yeah, when I moved here, it was books were probably the number one kind of generator of effort involved in the move. So
And usually weight as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you about an article you wrote about the abolition of man, and it was specifically in relation to the NXIVM cult. So for people who have no idea what NXIVM was about, could you just give them a little bit of background?
Yeah, no, it's I had no idea what it was about until one night my wife and I were just trying to decide what to watch, and we found this documentary on HBO. It's called The Vow. It's a 9-part series. I think they might be planning to do a second season. But yeah, so it's this cult that started off actually in this weirdly innocuous way as an organization that claimed to provide these kind of personal and professional development training, just sort of ways to help you kind of maximize your effectiveness as a business person and in your personal life and whatever. So you could almost compare it to Scientology, which in its early days was kind of this unorthodox approach to psychotherapy and sort of later accrued all this weird sci-fi mythology. Um, but again, like Scientology, NXIVM kind of quickly shows its true colors. NXIVM, by the way, is spelled NXIVM. I guess the V being kind of the Latin U in that case. But yeah, it's run by this guy named Keith Raniere, and it becomes, not to the degree that Scientology was, but it becomes very popular among kind of a subset of people in Hollywood. So there's one actress named Allison Mack who was on the show Smallville, I believe, who's ensnared by it, and then there's another actress named Bonnie something who plays the young Beru Lars in Star Wars episodes 2 and 3, who ends up being a part of it for a long time as well. But they had kind of a subgroup within the group for female members who were referred to as slaves, literally, within this group. And they were pressured to brand themselves, physically brand themselves with the initials of the leader, Keith Raniere. He calls himself the Vanguard. They had to hand over nude photos to be used as blackmail material in case they ever left the organization. They were pressured to kind of starve themselves and lose unhealthy amounts of weight. And, as in all cults, of course, they had to have sex with Keith Raniere. It's always seems to be a common feature of cults and cult leaders, right?
And I think I saw in the news recently a bunch of them were sentenced.
Yeah, I know he ends up going. I know Keith Raniere ended up going to jail. I believe Allison Mack did as well. She was, she was kind of recruited to the cult early by him, but then ended up becoming kind of the top recruiter for this, abusive kind of subgroup within it. But the more I watched this, the more I just became convinced that so much of it, so much of these ideas and this ideology that Raniere developed was just, truly kind of demonic in a very real sense of the word, and was something right out of The Abolition of Man or That Hideous Strength.
And what was it in particular that made you think of the abolition of man?
So there were two specific moments in the show, and I actually have the transcript here in front of me, so I'll just read it off. This is, I believe it's the first time Allison Mack and Raniere ever meet. And he says, "Is art important to you?" And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Why?" And she says, "Well, when I go see a film or I see a piece of artwork, something happens to me that's so exciting and wonderful, blissful, joyful, right? And he responds to her and says, "You know you can practice generating an extreme feeling of joy over anything. What if artistic endeavors were really bogus? What if art was just an excuse for those who couldn't do? The most excitement you've ever felt is yours to feel all the time, independent of art. The bad news is you sort of have to divorce yourself from the thought that it comes from the art. And if you feel that art is necessary for that, that's almost a self-condemnation." And interestingly, like then she actually responds to that by beginning to cry. It's like she almost instinctively realizes how terrifying this is, but obviously that kind of revulsion that she feels initially goes away after a while. Just as Lewis said it would. What's the line is like, it's like the first day in the dissecting room, right? Eventually, you might feel squeamish about this, but you'll get over it. But that doesn't make it okay.
And so it's sort of a parallel to the beginning of the abolition of man with the argument over the waterfall. Is it indeed sublime, or is it are you merely having subjective sublime feelings about the waterfall?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's essentially what he's telling her, right? Is that, is that your response to the art doesn't say anything about the art. It can't be sort of congruous or incongruous to that piece of art. It's completely arbitrary, right? You might as well feel bliss over looking at something that's objectively horrifying, and you might just as well feel horror in looking at something beautiful, right? There's no sort of connection, right? There's no objective value there from the point of view of this, Raniere, this cult leader.
It's funny because the abolition of man is divided up into three main chapters, three main lectures,
Mm-hmm.
and Lewis makes the point about objective value early on, but it's only in the final lecture that you see the full inhumanity that comes from the middle chapter, having men without chests.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas just in that one little scene, this cult leader has gone from all the way through the abolition of man immensely quickly.
Yeah.
Because surely you must be able to see at that point that if what he's saying is true, everything is meaningless. Define your own meaning, no matter how horrendous it could be.
Yeah. So he actually says at the end, this was the other quote I kind of pulled out. And this is a moment where there's another character named Mark Vicente who spends literally 12 years as one of the leaders of this cult and eventually leaves and tries to convince other people to leave. And he's one of the most interesting people in this documentary because he's just so haunted by how much of his life he wasted and how many people he led astray and hurt. But he's listening to a recording of Raniere, of one of their old conversations. And Raniere's saying to him, here's the quote, "There is no injustice, there is no unfair, there's just cause and effect. There's a part of you that's facing the question, what if morality doesn't mean anything? And when you abandon all good, truly you'll come to a point where you must construct good. You understand that is the basis of our whole curriculum. Everything we do is about that. We are constructing a definition of good."
Woof.
Yeah. And I mean, he has this system that he literally gets a patent for, and that's kind of this form of therapy that he uses that's incredibly effective. Again, I can only attribute it to some sort of demonic influence. I can only think, but it's funny. He calls them technologies, right? He doesn't call it a system or a method. He calls it a technology.
Very sci-fi.
Yeah, exactly, and it's it's very frightening. But it really goes to Lewis's point about the ability to use the technological and means we've developed in order to reduce humanity to raw material, to kind of putty in our hands, right?
Mm-hmm. And then you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you've constructed your own good. Mm-hmm. There is no Tao.
Yeah, exactly. So, like I said earlier, it's like you could look at bad art and feel good. You could look at good art and feel bad. It doesn't matter. But that also, leads directly into this pattern of abuse that you see in the cult, because if you feel horror at being told to brand yourself, or if you feel horror at being asked to sleep with this guy that you don't want to sleep with, then that's not because this action that you're being asked to take is objectively bad or harmful for you. It's because you've got some hangups that you need to get over. Right? There's one anecdote from another scene where he asks this woman I think he asked her to like run headfirst as fast as she can into a tree. And she says, "I don't want to do that," obviously. And
because there's cause and effect.
Yeah, exactly.
And if I run into a tree, it's going to hurt.
And I mean, you see this on screen, but he is able to instantly get under her skin by saying like, "Well, why? What's stopping you? Like, it sounds like you just have some inhibitions that you have to overcome." and it works on her. Like, it's terrifying.
That is horrific. The idea that somebody could do something so self-destructive just because some guy said that you should.
Yeah, exactly. But it makes sense. I mean, it reminds me of that scene in that Hideous Strength when they ask Mark to trample on a crucifix. And he's, you know, he says, he's like, he's not even a Christian. It doesn't, objectively, this symbol doesn't mean anything to him, but, you know, he's able somehow to realize that there's something inherently kind of disgusting about this action. You know, and it's just this very, it's not even really rooted for him in any, if I'm remembering the scene correctly, it's not even really rooted for him in any kind of reverence for Christianity. It's just sort of this very basic instinct that he has that it's wrong to kind of kick a man while he's down, right?
Mm.
Um,
And it's interesting to see the way that there's an idea of conformity baked in there as well. The Tao has been brushed aside, and a new standard has been set up by a new group, and that is the one that you now have to conform to.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's really this it's this idea that everything is kind of just hang-ups, right? That any kind of moral objection you could have to any sort of new idea is just, you know, it's what Lewis calls bulverism, right? Where it's the, you know, if you object to anything, it's because there's something in you that's keeping you from doing that, that's keeping you from accepting it, not because there's any kind of right flaw in the actual argument you're rejecting.
Yeah, it's like an ad hominem with some psychologizing thrown in for good measure.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, I've seen this with a lot of discourse about like sex work recently. So yeah, I've seen this discourse that goes on constantly, where someone will ask like, "How would you feel if if your girlfriend had an OnlyFans account, or for women, how would you feel if your boyfriend followed women on OnlyFans and donated money to them?" And people usually say like, "Well, I would feel bad." Um, and you know, this kind of feminist response you often get is like, well, you know, that's just a hang up you have, right? That's just the vestiges of this, you know, Puritan morality that you have to shake loose of. You know, what's the problem? Everyone's consenting here. Like, um, you know, and if you object to it, you get called all kinds of nasty things. I've been called an incel on Twitter for objecting to that, which is hilarious. I'm, you know, I'm married, so just definitionally, you've run into a problem there.
Mm-hmm.
And it says husband right in my Twitter bio, so but it's just funny. Like it's that leap is so easy, right? Like you must have this sort of kind of mental derangement if you object to my ideas.
And those are often presented axiomatically. There's not really an argument that goes along with it. It's just sort of this is a statement about what you should believe instead.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean that makes sense if there's if there's nothing normative left to appeal to, right?
Mm-hmm. And we were talking before the show, and I mentioned that I've been reading Dr. Michael Ward's After Humanity, which is his commentary on the abolition of man. And at the end of his introduction, he quotes Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue. And he makes the point that once objective value is gone, then it's just simply a matter of power. It's who can protest, because that's all you can really do, because you can't persuade, because there's nothing objective anymore. It's not about rational discourse or reasoning somebody to your position. It's much more about just strength and force. And in the NXIVM example, we see that play out in a very real sense. It was about power and control.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how you see this kind of flattening out, right? There was this is kind of a minor example, but I remember seeing this article where a someone was admitted to an Ivy League school, and they had to write a 300-word admission essay. And you know, I don't know how much the essay weighs in the actual admissions decision. Like, I'm sure that, you know, based on his grades and everything else, like he was a good candidate for this. But for his essay, he just wrote the phrase "Black Lives Matter" 100 times. And I thought, well, like, you know, you could have written 300 words about why you support this movement, like laying out, you know, your reasons for why this movement, you know, laying them out even very forcefully, you know, your reasons for why this movement is worthy of support. But, you know, the idea that we've reached a point where kind of at the highest echelons of society, you're being rewarded just for kind of parroting slogans in this way. Like literally just parroting slogans is somewhat worrisome. Yeah, but I think that goes back to the idea of, there's no more persuasion, there's only protest, there's only power, right? Yeah, I haven't gotten to that book yet. I've interacted with Michael Ward a little bit. He seems very kind from the interactions I've had. I reached out to email him about some questions I had about Arthur Greaves and his friendship with Lewis, and he was really helpful in answering those. Which his responses are quoted in an article I wrote that is still in kind of editorial limbo. So maybe we'll see that someday, and I can come back and talk about it. Who knows?
Absolutely. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this before we wrap things up?
I don't know. Yeah, it's I can't. It's hard to overstate what an excellent and indispensable book The Abolition of Man is for for understanding just everything that you see in society now. Like, it's probably one of the 2 or 3 works I go back to most often. I joked one time that it's my favorite dystopian novel because it catches you so unaware, right? It starts off as him humbly saying, like, "Hey, this new English textbook came out, and I've got a few thoughts about it." And by the end, you just have this incredibly well realized, like, dystopian horror show that he's setting out. You go, "Wait, how do we get from there to here?" But you go back and trace the argument, and you're like, it all works.
It begins with a very small step. When I read The Abolition of Man, I read it completely cold. I had read a handful of Lewis's apologetics at this point. I think I'd read Screwtape, Problem of Pain, Great Divorce, Mere Christianity. And then this was the next book that I picked up, primarily just because it was short. Yeah. I thought, I can knock out another one. And I started reading, and I was like, what is he talking about? Why are we discussing grammar? And yeah, to quote a meme, by the time you get to the end of The Abolition of Man, you go, well, that escalated quickly.
It's funny, though. It's one of those things where, you see this over and over again, where people who, kind of are coming from some of the same perspectives as Lewis was then today, and are continuing to sound the alarm. They're constantly written off as being alarmist. So the person who comes to mind is Rod Dreher, who is like who is very frequently kind of caricatured as all of his, blog posts are like, "Oh, the sky is falling." Here's this one instance from the news, and this shows that civilization is doomed. But at the same time, like, the people who I'm sure made fun of Lewis when The Abolition of Man came out, I can imagine they would have never been able to conceive of some of the things that are taken as normal today. So I think that Lewis has really been vindicated by that, and I think it really goes to show that the slippery slope isn't always a fallacy, right?
This is true. One of the things I'd really like to see somebody do is to try and turn the Space Trilogy into a series of movies, because I think by the time you get to that hideous strength, it could have a very interesting reaction in today's culture. Yeah,
I can imagine that. Plus, I just want to see Mr. Baltitude on screen.
An unbearable performance, no doubt. And on that terrible pun, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And listeners, join us next time when we'll go further up and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.